Before dawn, a lone countess crosses the stone bridge, winter mist clinging to her cloak, a lullaby trembling on her lips. In her arms, an infant swaddled in a noblewoman's shawl. One kiss, one torn blue ribbon, and a choice no heart should bear. By sunrise, a physician finds the child, and a secret that could unmake an empire of lies. Duty collides with desire. A past buried in silence claws its way back to light. Who will be ruined, and who will be redeemed? Tell me, where in the world are you listening from, and what do you crave most in a period romance? Forbidden love, fierce justice, or a second chance? Bath, England, February of the year 1852. A city veiled in frost, wrapped in silence, and still sleeping beneath the heavy sky of a winter not yet finished. Before the gas lamps flickered out, before the market women stirred their fires, and long before the carriages of the aristocracy began their daily procession down Milsom Street, a lone figure moved like a shadow along the sloping road toward the eastern edge of the city. Countess Verena Ainsley, scarcely 19 years old, walked in silence. Her boots crunched softly upon the icy cobblestones, each step more difficult than the last. A thick cloak of midnight blue wool wrapped tightly around her slender frame, trimmed with jet beads that caught the faintest glimmer of moonlight. Beneath the cloak, her gloved hands trembled as they cradled a bundle no larger than a loaf of bread, yet heavier than the weight of the world itself. The stone bridge stood at the edge of Bath like a quiet sentinel of secrets. Its ancient arches curved over the dark waters of the River Avon, where morning mist swirled in slow spirals, swallowing sound, blurring shapes, making the world itself seem unsure. She reached the center of the bridge and stopped. The wind, sharp and bitter, tugged at the edge of her veil, loosening a strand of chestnut-brown hair from her chignon. Her breath rose in pale clouds as she looked down at the tiny sleeping face nestled in the folds of the shawl. Her mother's shawl, the last thing of comfort she had left. The baby stirred, a soft whimper escaping lips the color of rose-petal silk. Verena knelt. She laid the bundle gently against the base of the stone railing. A torn blue ribbon, a relic from her own girlhood, was tied around the infant's wrist. She pressed a kiss to the baby's forehead, lingering there, her lips trembling. Then, with her voice nearly lost in the wind, she sang. It was a lullaby from long ago, soft and slow, in a key barely above a whisper. A tune her mother used to hum on stormy nights. A melody only the walls of Ainsley Court remembered now. When it was done, Verena rose without a sound. Her face was pale as marble, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She took 3 steps back, then 3 more, and turned. The mist closed around her like a curtain. In moments, she was gone. But the lullaby remained, floating, echoing, lingering. Not long after, though the sky remained the color of pewter, another figure crossed the bridge. A tall man, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a thick brown overcoat, his boots slick with the grime of long streets. Dr. Gabriel Hartswell, returning from a night call to a cholera-stricken family in the lower quarter, walked with purpose, though weariness clung to him. He stopped. There, nestled in the shadows, where the railing met the pillar, was something pale, a shawl, a shape, a sound, a child. He approached slowly, heart suddenly pounding beneath layers of wool and responsibility. Kneeling, he found the baby not dead, but very much alive. Its cheeks flushed with cold, the breath shallow but steady. The woolen shawl, fine and aged, smelled faintly of lavender and firewood. A blue ribbon caught his eye, frayed, but tied with delicate care. This child, he murmured, voice hoarse from the night's work, was not left by accident. The fabric was of noble make. The buttons on the infant's gown were mother of pearl, not the tin used by working families. No note, no symbol, no name, but a purpose whispered in every stitch. Gabriel hesitated. Protocol dictated he alert the parish immediately. But protocol had no place on this bridge. He looked over the edge, at the slow waters curling beneath the arches. Then he looked back at the baby. He made his choice. By the time the church bells rang 8, the child was asleep again, this time in a woven basket by the fireplace of number 17 Gay Street, wrapped in linen warmed by coals and watched over by Mrs. Eleanora Pike, who was pouring tea with an expression of deep concentration. "Well, he's no common babe, I'll tell you that," she muttered, adjusting the cap on her greying hair. "Look at the curve of his mouth. And that gown. Lace finer than I wore on my wedding day." Gabriel sat at the table, freshly washed but silent. His hands were clean, but he kept clenching them as if trying to remember how to let go. "You didn't leave your name at the surgery this morning," Eleanora added, not unkindly. "You left that boy's name instead." "Nicholas," he said quietly. "It seemed right." She nodded, eyes narrowing. "You know who he belongs to." "I don't," he replied. But he did, or at least he suspected. The lullaby, the shawl, the ribbon, and the eyes. Grey-green, unmistakable. "Do you plan to keep him here?" she asked, lowering her voice. "Because the moment someone finds out—" "I plan to keep him warm," Gabriel said, "and alive. After that, we'll see." Eleanora looked at her brother then, not as a sister, but as a woman who had seen the world. She saw the flicker of something in his face, not guilt, not fear, conviction. "Very well," she said, lifting the tea to her lips. "But you'd best be careful, Gabriel Hartswell. That child came wrapped in silk and silence, and both are known to strangle." Outside, the frost on the windows began to melt, forming rivulets down the glass. Inside, the fire crackled, and Nicholas slept with the peacefulness of one unaware of the war that had already begun around him. Not far away, in the tall windows of Ainsley Court, Verena stood alone, staring at the morning mist, a hand to her throat, the other pressed to the glass. She did not move, not even as the bells chimed again. She had crossed the bridge before dawn, but the consequences had only just begun. Bath, in the waning days of February, wore its silence like a heavy mantle. The cold no longer bit with winter's cruelty, but lingered in the air with a sullen persistence, as if unwilling to yield to spring. Morning frost still laced the railings along Queen's Parade, and the Avon moved sluggishly beneath sheets of brittle ice. In such stillness, secrets could travel unnoticed, sewn into hems, whispered over tea, or hidden beneath a ribbon's knot. Dr. Gabriel Hartswell had not slept. From the moment he placed the infant, now named Nicholas, into the cradle by his hearth, his mind had whirled with the quiet, relentless urgency of questions. He had seen the signs, the fineness of the christening gown, the quality of the shawl, the sweet perfume of dried lavender, too refined to belong to any working-class girl. But most of all, it was the ribbon that clung to his thoughts. A ribbon torn down the middle, pale blue silk fraying at the edges. A ribbon tied with intention, not haste. Now, 5 mornings later, Gabriel stood on the worn stone steps of St. Luke's Parish, boots damp with melted snow, his breath misting before him as the vicar flipped slowly through the baptismal registry. "There's no child listed without a surname?" Gabriel asked, though he already sensed the answer. The vicar, an elderly man with thinning hair and a tremor in his hands, shook his head. "Not since the new year. Only 2 baptisms this month, both legitimate, both known to me. No inquiries from noble families either. If someone's trying to keep the birth quiet, Doctor, they've done a fine job of it." Gabriel nodded, thanked him, and stepped back out into the brittle morning light. He crossed the square slowly, his coat buttoned high against the wind, his physician's bag swinging at his side. He passed the apothecary, the hatmaker, the row of bakeries that spilled warmth into the chill air, and paused outside the discreet brass plate of Midwife Albury. The woman was brisk, practical, and, as he suspected, nervous at the sight of him. "No, Dr. Hartswell," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "No lady of standing has passed through here in months, and certainly no babe born in secret." He did not press her. He only thanked her, and she, relieved, retreated back into the scent of boiling linen and peppermint oil. By noon, he had visited 3 more midwives. He left each with the same gnawing absence in his gut. No one had seen the child born. No one admitted to helping the mother, but the evidence told another story. The child had been born in town within the last week. He was well-fed, recently swaddled, and placed in a location where he was sure to be found. Not left to fate, but carefully delivered into safety. By dusk, Gabriel returned to his surgery on Gay Street, where Eleonora met him at the door, her cheeks flushed and her hands flour-dusted from baking. "He slept through half the afternoon," she said. "Woke only to feed. Has the appetite of a magistrate." Gabriel managed a weary smile. "Good. He'll need strength." Eleonora studied her brother's face, saw the tension beneath the stubble of his jaw, the sleepless strain in his eyes. "You won't find her by chasing shadows," she said gently. "I'm not looking for her," he lied. That night, he sat by the fire with the torn ribbon in his palm. It was no longer than his little finger, its edges clean but frayed. He had tucked it into a small tin and hidden it in his desk, as if protecting it might protect the truth it held. Still, it burned in his pocket, like a secret not yet spoken aloud. 3 evenings later, Bath came to life. The pump room glittered with candlelight, chandeliers casting their golden webs across ivory walls, and the polished sheen of the marble floor. Ladies in silks and satins moved with elegance and practiced smiles, their gloved hands fluttering like birds as they fanned themselves or adjusted hairpins. Gentlemen in finely tailored coats and pressed cravats bowed and murmured compliments beneath the strains of a string quartet. Gabriel had not come to dance. He had come only because he was invited by Mr. Arkwright, a retired colonel whose gout he had treated, and whose gratitude was both generous and socially connected. It was not a world Gabriel frequented, but it was a world where truths were often dressed in satin. He stood near the refreshment table, glass untouched in his hand, when the quartet began a new piece, a lullaby, slow and minor, its melody threading the air like a memory. His breath caught. He turned toward the sound, and there she was, Countess Verena Ainsley. She stood near the musicians, poised but still. Her gown was a soft mauve-grey silk, modest yet elegant, her black velvet choker gleaming softly at her throat. Her hair, parted in the center, was swept into a low chignon, with a few tendrils curling near her ears. Her eyes, grey-green, clear and distant, were fixed on the floor, her expression unreadable. But as the melody rose, her lips moved. She was singing it, quietly, almost imperceptibly, the same lullaby he had heard on the stone bridge. She lifted her head, and her gaze met his. For one breathless moment, the room fell away. The crowd, the music, the clinking of glasses, none of it mattered. They looked at each other, and in her eyes he saw something flicker, recognition, fear, defiance. Then she blinked, and it was gone. An older gentleman approached her from the side, placing a possessive hand beneath her elbow. Sir Reginald Carow. Gabriel recognized him from reputation alone, guardian of the Ainsley fortune, a man of ruthless charm and quiet menace. Sir Reginald leaned in, said something low against Verena's ear. She nodded, her jaw tight. Her gloved hand came up to adjust her shawl, and there, visible for just an instant, was the pale blue ribbon tied around her wrist. Gabriel's breath stilled. The same ribbon, torn. She wore it beneath layers of lace and silk, hidden from the world. But he had seen it. The moment ended. Sir Reginald steered her away with practiced ease, like a man accustomed to silencing inconvenient things. Gabriel stood rooted to the floor, glass forgotten in his hand. He returned home under a sky of restless stars, his coat collar turned high against the wind. The streets were quieter now, the gas lamps flickering like tired sentinels. In the distance, the bells of St. Michael's tolled 9. Inside the surgery, Eleonora had left a lamp burning low in the hallway. Nicholas slept peacefully in the cradle, his fist curled near his cheek. Gabriel sat at his desk and took out the ribbon. Slowly, he unwrapped the ribbon from the infant's bundle, laid it on the desk, and beside it placed the one he had seen on Verina's wrist, his memory as clear and sharp as glass. They were of the same fabric, same width, same fray, torn from the same piece. She had left the child. He knew it now, not as suspicion, but as certainty. But why? Why would a countess leave her child in the open, where anyone might find him? Why risk the child's health, his future, his very name? The answers pressed against his thoughts like storm clouds at the edge of a horizon. And as the child stirred in his sleep, Gabriel felt the weight of something he could not yet name settle over him. Not guilt, not fear, responsibility. The ribbon was no longer just a clue. It was a vow, a thread that bound them all, silent but unbreakable. Somewhere in the city, a mother had made a choice, and somewhere deep in Gabriel's chest, something had begun to change. He would not chase shadows, no, but the truth was no longer in shadow. It had a name, a face, a voice like a lullaby, and it wore a ribbon. The chimneys of Bath breathed grey smoke into a pale, bruised sky. A damp wind pressed against the stone facades of the grand houses along Sydney Place, rattling panes and tugging at curtains, as if the city itself whispered of secrets hidden behind polished glass and marble thresholds. Gabriel Hartswell rode in silence. The hooves of his hired horse muffled by the wet cobblestones, the reins cool beneath his gloved fingers. He had not been summoned. His visit to Ainsley Court had been arranged through a polite letter, penned in a hand so rigidly formal it could only have belonged to a butler. The excuse: a mild spell of dizziness suffered by the young Countess during an afternoon reading. It was a thin veil, the sort of ailment ladies of society claimed when they needed a reason that would not scandalize nor reveal. Gabriel recognized it at once, for he had seen real illness, the kind that broke bodies and spirits alike. Dizziness did not require a doctor of his station, but still he came. The gates of Ainsley Court creaked open with slow ceremony. The hedges were clipped to harsh perfection. The gravel walk was spotless. No laughter echoed across the grounds, no hurried steps or voices of children. It was a house that held its breath. A footman led Gabriel into the morning room, where gold-framed landscapes lined the walls and the fire burned with rigid symmetry. The scent of beeswax and rosewater hung in the air like an invisible veil. She entered without fanfare. Verina Ainsley, Countess of Ainsley, wore a gown of pale lilac wool, modest in its cut but finely made. The high collar framed her face like a cameo, the porcelain skin, the soft chestnut waves pinned low at her nape, the clear grey-green eyes. She did not extend her hand in greeting, nor did she offer a curtsy. She simply met his gaze. "Dr. Hartswell," she said softly, motioning for him to sit. "Thank you for coming." Gabriel bowed his head, removing his gloves slowly. "It's always a pleasure to be of service to the Ainsley household." A flicker passed over her features, something between gratitude and pain. "As you may suspect," she said, taking her seat near the fire, "my ailment is not medical. At least, not in the sense your expertise traditionally demands." Gabriel watched her carefully. "Then why have I been called?" She inhaled, eyes drifting briefly to the window. Beyond the pane, the branches of a leafless tree swayed like skeletal fingers in the wind. "Because I know what you saw," she said. "At the musicale, you recognized the ribbon." Silence settled between them like dust on velvet. "I did," he answered quietly. Verina folded her hands in her lap. They were slender hands, gloved in dove-grey kidskin. "You must understand," she continued, voice trembling beneath its poise, "what I have done, what I have risked, was not born of cruelty. It was born of desperation." He did not interrupt her. He only watched. "I left the child there because I had no other choice," she said. "My guardian, Sir Reginald, must not discover that he exists. If he does, he will erase him. Erase him from every record, every claim, every breath. Gabriel's eyes narrowed. What do you mean by erase? She looked at him then, and for the first time the mask slipped. Her voice broke like glass. He will have the child declared illegitimate. He will pay the magistrate if he must, bribe the clergyman, alter the registers. He has done worse. The physician's chest tightened. You speak as though you are powerless. She blinked. A woman in mourning, 19, with no father, no husband, no son, the law will acknowledge. Do you know what that means in the eyes of men like him? He did. And yet, hearing it from her lips gave it a weight that no textbook or courtroom ever had. Verena stood slowly and crossed to the window. I thought the bridge was far enough. I thought if I left him in the open, wrapped, swaddled, protected, someone good would find him. Someone who would not ask questions. Someone who might give him a chance at a life that was not wrapped in scandal. Gabriel rose too. You left your child to fate, Countess, but fate did not find him. Her eyes met his. You did. He did not know when he had taken the step closer, only that now they stood within reach of each other. The fire cast golden shadows across her cheek, and he saw that her composure was not strength, but survival, stitched together like fine embroidery hiding frayed cloth beneath. Why tell me this? He asked, his voice low. Why not let me go on believing it was a nameless woman, a servant girl, a ghost in the fog? Because you did not believe that, she replied, and because you've not yet gone to the magistrate, which means you are a man I can trust, or one who still hasn't decided. Gabriel stepped back, gathering his breath. And what would you have me do? Verena returned to her seat, every movement precise, deliberate. Say nothing. To anyone. Not now. Not yet. Let the world think whatever it wishes. But let the child remain with you. Safe. Hidden. He hesitated. What of the future? What of your claim? His name? Her eyes glistened. What is a name when the alternative is destruction? There was a long pause. The wind hissed at the windows. Somewhere far in the house, a door creaked open and shut again. Gabriel adjusted his coat. Very well, he said. For now, I will remain silent. But know this, Countess, I do not keep secrets well, especially not when the truth cries in the night. She nodded, and though her posture remained proud, a tremor passed through her gloved fingers, so fleeting it might have been imagined. As he bowed and turned to go, her voice stopped him. Doctor, she said. He looked back. Is the child well? A softer tone entered his voice. Strong, sleeps through the night. His lungs are clear, his eyes, yours. A breath escaped her, one she had been holding for days, perhaps weeks. She lowered her head. Thank you. He inclined his head and departed. That evening, the fire at number 17 Gay Street crackled with a strange intensity. Gabriel sat in his chair, eyes closed, the weight of what he had learned settling across his shoulders like a woolen shroud. Eleonora entered with a fresh pot of tea and set it down with a firm clatter. Well? She asked. He opened his eyes slowly. You saw her, didn't you? Yes. And? She's afraid. And with reason. Eleonora took the seat across from him, her knitting untouched in her lap. You intend to keep the child here? For now. She studied him, her voice softer. Is this about duty, Gabriel? Or something deeper? He did not answer. She leaned forward. Because if you're falling in love with a woman you cannot have, you'd best admit it before it consumes you. He met her gaze. I am not in love. She arched a brow. Not yet. The fire flickered between them. Nicholas stirred in his cradle. And Gabriel, who had once sworn to heal without prejudice, to serve without question, now found himself tethered to a secret that was neither medical nor moral, but something far more dangerous. A secret wrapped in lavender wool and a torn ribbon. A secret that breathed, cried, needed, and would not be denied. The fog rolled in early that morning, seeping into Bath like a memory that refused to stay buried. It clung to the rooftops and softened the edges of the elegant facades, casting shadows where none ought to linger. From his window at number 17 Gay Street, Dr. Gabriel Hartswell watched as the world outside blurred, its certainties dissolving into mist. A perfect metaphor, he thought grimly, for the truth he was beginning to chase. Truth wrapped not in facts or medicine, but in names, titles, and ink. It was not in Gabriel's nature to trespass into legal affairs. His world dealt with wounds of the body, not of the law. But this child, Nicholas, warm and breathing, swaddled in lies not of his own making, had drawn Gabriel into a realm where medicine could not protect and silence could be fatal. By mid-morning, he found himself in the study of Reverend Thomas Brackley, a man whose sermons were plain, but whose wisdom lingered long after the pews had emptied. The curate's home was modest, its shelves overfilled with parish records, prayer books, and the occasional volume of poetry worn soft by time. "Thank you for seeing me," Gabriel said, removing his gloves. "I know this isn't standard clerical business." Brackley, tall and spare, with salt and pepper hair and eyes sharpened by years of confessions, nodded without needing further explanation. "You're not a man who wastes time, Doctor. Sit. Tell me what you seek." Gabriel sat. The lamp between them flickered as the fog thickened outside. "I need to see the Ainsley marriage settlement," he said, "and anything tied to amendments or codicils made after the ceremony." The curate did not blink. "You suspect forgery?" "I suspect injustice," Gabriel replied, "and I believe the truth may lie in ink." With a sigh, Brackley retrieved a wooden box from the back room, wrapped in a faded cloth bearing the church's seal. He placed it gently on the table, as one might place a coffin. The smell of wax, parchment, and something older, perhaps regret, rose from within. Together, they examined the documents, Brackley's long fingers turning the pages with the care of a man accustomed to history's fragility. "There," Gabriel said, pointing. "That line." Brackley adjusted his spectacles and squinted. The codicil, inserted as an afterthought, claimed to amend the original marriage settlement by excluding any unverified offspring from inheritance. The wording was vague, but the intent was clear. It was a noose disguised as formality. Gabriel leaned closer. "That handwriting, it's not the same as the others." Brackley nodded. The original clauses were penned by Mr. Standish, the Ainsley family solicitor, a man known for his neat, symmetrical hand. He tapped the amended clause. "This is slanted, uneven, different ink. Could Standish confirm it?" Gabriel asked. "He's retired to Surrey," Brackley murmured, "but I imagine he'd recognize his own signature, or the lack of it." They sat in silence. "Are you prepared for what this could become?" Brackley finally asked. "Because this, my friend, is no longer medicine. This is war, and those who wage war on paper often wield swords made of coin and influence." Gabriel's jaw tensed. "I don't care for war, but I won't watch a child vanish because of a lie." Brackley nodded once. "Then you must move carefully, with ink of your own." Elsewhere in the city, the candlelight in Sir Reginald Caro's study glowed golden against the rich mahogany walls, casting long shadows across shelves of law tomes and family ledgers. A fire roared in the hearth, not for warmth, but for dominance. It filled the room with the scent of burning oak and smoke. Sir Reginald stood by the window, a glass of claret in hand, watching the fog curl around the hedges of Ainsley Court. His mouth was drawn in its usual line of disdain. Across from him, seated stiffly in a brocade chair, was Lord Julian Harbury, a widower with ambitions as polished as his boots. "She's a quiet girl," Harbury said, swirling his drink with restrained elegance. "A touch too solemn for my taste, but I understand her dowry is untouched." Reginald turned, his expression impassive. "She's a countess by name, and a pawn by necessity. You require a noble wife to sweeten your campaign, and I require her safely married. Quickly." Harbury raised an eyebrow. "You speak of her as though she were a cow at auction." Sir Reginald smiled without warmth. "Better that than a mare gone wild." He crossed to the mantel, retrieved a letter sealed in wax, and held it up. "This is the final clause. Upon your engagement, The remainder of the Ainsley estate is transferred to joint oversight, your name included. Once married, you may dispose of any complications. Harbury took the letter, studying the seal. You mean the child? Reginald's eyes darkened. There is no child, and if someone says otherwise, then they will find themselves very swiftly without patronage, protection or peace. This city listens to wealth, not whispers. Harbury raised his glass. To silence, then. Verena sat in her chamber, the winter light dimming as the sky turned to ash. Her hands, bare and cold, rested on a sheet of thick cream paper. The ink bottle beside her remained unopened. The quill waited. She had not written a letter in weeks, and yet now the words pressed against her chest like a bird desperate to be freed. She had overheard the conversation, not all of it, just enough. A closed door, a half-raised voice, the rustle of parchment. Her marriage was being arranged. Her name, her fortune, her silence. The baby, the life she had cradled, the soul she had left on the bridge was to be erased with a signature. Tears did not come. They had dried long ago, but her hands began to move. Dearest Dr. Hartswell, you once asked me why I chose silence over scandal. I fear I can no longer remain silent. They mean to marry me to a man whose name curdles the very air, to bind me to a future stitched with lies. I cannot fight them openly, not yet. But I beg you, whatever it takes, protect the child. He is all that remains of a truth I was forced to bury. Yours in fear and in faith, V.A. She folded the letter with trembling precision, sealing it with wax and the imprint of her mother's locket. A servant would deliver it at first light, anonymously. She lit the fire herself and watched the flames devour a sheet of parchment bearing the name Julian Harbury. Ashes curled into the hearth. The following afternoon, Gabriel was tending to a patient on Queen Square, a lady of considerable means and even greater gossip. Her fingers were adorned with garnets, her perfume cloying, her tongue sharp as a scalpel. I do hope, doctor, that your little guest is not interfering with your work, she said with a pointed smile. It's all over the club, you know, that you've taken in some orphan. Very noble of you. Gabriel remained silent, measuring her pulse. Of course, she continued, fanning herself slowly. Some say the child is no orphan at all, that he bears a rather aristocratic resemblance. He met her gaze then, calm and steady. Children resemble many things. Truth is not always among them. She chuckled. Oh, I don't judge, doctor. I admire discretion. So very rare these days. She leaned closer, eyes gleaming. But do be careful. There are those who do not take kindly to men who meddle in the affairs of the peerage, especially when the stakes are hereditary. Gabriel inclined his head politely. Your heart rate is a little fast. I'd suggest fewer rumors and more rest. She laughed, but her smile faltered. When he returned home that evening, the letter was waiting on his desk. He read it once, then again, and again. Each word seared into his conscience, each sentence a tether binding him tighter to the truth. He folded it carefully, placed it beneath the ribbon in the tin, and sat in silence. Outside, the fog thickened once more, and the city drew its curtains against the dark. But inside number 17, the fire burned steadily, fueled not just by coal, but by the slow rising heat of purpose, ashes and ink, lies and vows. He would not turn away, not now. Twilight fell early over Bath, casting its dusky veil upon the ancient stones and winding alleys like a secret whispered through time. The sky hung low, heavy with the promise of rain, and the Roman baths, those hallowed remnants of empire and ritual, rested in solemn silence, veiled in steam and shadow. Beneath the colonnades, where generations had once whispered prayers to forgotten gods, two souls met in quiet defiance of the world above them. Verena Ainsley stepped through the hidden side entrance, her cloak drawn tightly about her. The damp air clung to her hair, curling the loose tendrils that had escaped her veil. Her breath rose in ghostly wisps as she descended the ancient stone steps, the faint echo of her boots lost beneath the trickle of thermal water. There was no sound, but the steady rhythm of the springs, as though the very earth wept in hushed understanding. Gabriel Hartswell waited beneath the arch of a carved Roman niche, his figure still and shadowed, his hat in hand. He had arrived before her, as he always did, led more by instinct than habit, more by a calling than by duty. When he saw her emerge from the mist, something in him tightened, not with fear, but with an ache he no longer dared to name. She stopped before him, her eyes searching his face. "No one saw you?" she asked softly. "No one," he replied. "You?" She shook her head. "I told the housekeeper I was attending Vespers." Gabriel offered a faint, humorless smile. "Then let us make this a prayer." Verena hesitated. Then, with trembling fingers, she removed her gloves and tucked them into her cloak. "I have kept this too long, and every moment of silence has felt like betrayal." He did not press her. He simply stood, still and open, as the steam coiled between them like incense. "The child," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "is not mine." Gabriel's breath caught. He was born to my sister Rowena," Verena continued, lifting her chin. She became ill shortly after his birth. A fever of the lungs. It took her before the end of autumn. There was no dramatic collapse, no sobs, only the restrained composure of a woman who had long ago wept herself empty. "She was not married," Verena said, "and the father was not a man who would take responsibility. He was of standing, high enough to ruin her, but protected enough to remain untouched." Gabriel felt a wave of quiet rage rise in his chest, but he kept it still. "And you?" "I did what I had to," she said. "I married a man already dying, a distant cousin with debts and no heirs. He agreed to the arrangement. The child would be passed as ours, I would inherit the estate, and Rowena's honor would die with her." She lowered her eyes, voice thickening. It was not love. It was not even kindness. It was necessity. Gabriel took a step forward, gently. "And Sir Reginald?" Verena's expression changed. No longer sorrow, something colder. "He discovered the truth. I don't know how. Perhaps a letter Rowena never meant to send. Perhaps the midwife was bribed, but once he knew, he claimed control over everything. He threatened to reveal all, to the bishop, to the crown, to Parliament if need be. And the child. He said he would see Nicholas declared a bastard, that he would destroy Rowena's name, revoke the estate, have the child taken to an orphanage under a false name. He has the means, Doctor, the influence. You cannot imagine what he is capable of behind closed doors." Her voice trembled, but her spine remained straight. "So I chose silence. I let him arrange the engagement to Lord Harbury. I nodded when he spoke of duty. But when I saw Nicholas again, when I saw your face in the crowd," her voice broke then, for just a moment. "I couldn't go through with it. I had to act, even if it costs me everything." Gabriel closed the distance between them until they stood a breath apart. "You did not fail your sister," he said quietly. "You gave her child a chance. You bore the shame, the weight, the silence, and still you carry him in your heart." He reached into the pocket of his coat and drew forth a tiny silver locket. It was tarnished, but delicate. Inside, a lock of soft brown hair and a name engraved in miniature script. "Rowena Ainsley," he said. "I found this sewn into the child's shawl." Verena's lips parted. She reached out and took it as though it were a living thing. "She wore it every day," she whispered, "even as her fever worsened." Gabriel touched her wrist, his fingers warm against her skin. "You are not alone in this, not anymore." The silence between them was charged now, not with uncertainty, but with something deeper, a promise. Unspoken, yet felt in every breath, every glance, every inch of space not crossed. Verena closed her hand around the locket and nodded once. "Then help me protect him, whatever it takes." Gabriel's eyes did not waver. "I will." Elsewhere, in a far less sacred chamber, Reverend Thomas Brackley stood before his bishop, a man robed in velvet and adorned with the polite cruelty of religious power. "This child you shelter," the bishop said, his voice cool, "has become the subject of unseemly rumor." Brackley, tall and straight despite the weight of years, offered no apology. "The child is innocent." "Innocent," the bishop echoed. "He is without name, without claim, and now perhaps without morality. You tread dangerously close to scandal." Brackley's hands, long and thin, folded calmly behind his back. "Then let the scandal fall upon me. I will not see a babe turned out into the cold for the comfort of titled men who live without conscience." The bishop narrowed his eyes. "Consider your post, Reverend, your parish, your future." Brackley smiled faintly. "I serve God, not fashion." He turned and left the chamber without waiting for permission. At the edge of town, in the small garden behind the modest house on Gay Street, Eleanora Pike hung fresh linens under a grey sky. Nicholas slept in a basket beneath the fig tree, bundled tightly in wool. A neighbour passed by the gate, a stout woman with a market basket and a sharp tongue. She paused. "That the foundling they speak of?" Eleanora did not look up. "That's my nephew." The woman raised an eyebrow. "Didn't know you had any brothers left." Eleanora clipped a sheet to the line. "I don't." There was silence. "Looks healthy," the woman said finally. "Strong lungs." "Stronger than many men I've known," Eleanora replied, meeting her gaze. The neighbor sniffed, adjusted her basket, and walked on. Later that day, another neighbor brought warm bread. A young apprentice left a small wooden horse on the garden gate, and when Nicholas cried in the afternoon, the sound no longer seemed so foreign to the street. The tide was turning, slowly, quietly, like a woman's resolve, forged not in rage but in endurance, and beneath the rising clouds the truth waited, ready to be named. The grey stone of the Bath Guildhall stood sombre beneath a pewter sky, its arched windows weeping with the condensation of winter's stubborn chill. Inside, the air was thick with expectation, and not even the low murmurs of gathered townsfolk could disturb the stern silence of the chamber where justice, or something bearing its name, was said to be served. On that particular morning, the usual rhythm of petty disputes and land disagreements gave way to something far more delicate and dangerous: the question of a child. Not one of lineage or fortune, but of blood, silence, and power. Dr. Gabriel Hartswell entered the room with quiet gravity, his tall frame straight beneath a dark frock coat, his physician's bag absent for once, replaced only by the steady beat of resolve in his chest. The moment his boots touched the tiled floor of the hall, he became a man under judgment, not for negligence or malpractice, but for daring to keep safe a child born of aristocratic scandal. The chamber was colder than he expected. At the far end, beneath the emblem of the crown, sat Magistrate Harold Linton, a man of rigid profile and eyes like storm-worn slate. Beside him stood the clerk, already organizing parchment and seals. To Gabriel's right, the pews were half-filled with curious townspeople, merchants, matrons, tradesmen, those who had heard whispers and came not for truth, but for spectacle. And to his left, seated with calculated composure, was Sir Reginald Carow, his gloved hands resting atop a silver-handled cane, his cravat impeccably tied, his gaze sharpened to ice. Gabriel did not look at him. He fixed his attention on the center of the hall, where a single chair waited. He had barely reached it when the doors behind him opened again, and a hush fell. Countess Verena Ainsley entered. She was veiled, her cloak the color of storm-touched lavender, trimmed in simple black. Her posture was regal despite the eyes that followed her, dissecting her with every step. She made no plea for acknowledgement. She took her place beside Gabriel and kept her gaze forward. The silence deepened. Sir Reginald rose. "My lord," he began, voice calm but coiled, "I bring before this court a matter most grievous. A child, illegitimately birthed and unlawfully harbored, has been taken into the home of this physician without consent, without guardianship, and without moral justification. I petition on behalf of the Ainsley estate that the infant be surrendered at once into the protection of the Crown until such time as proper arrangements may be made for his care." There was a rustle of fabric, a gasp from the rear. Gabriel stood, hands folded behind him. "The child was abandoned, my lord, left on the stone bridge in the dead of winter. No name, no parent, no claim. I found him. I kept him alive. That is my only offence." Sir Reginald's lip curled. "What nobility! And yet the good doctor fails to mention that the child bears the Ainsley jawline." His voice dipped into venom. "And that he now receives regular visits from a certain noble lady whose virtue, I regret to say, has already been questioned by many." The magistrate's eyes narrowed. "Enough, Sir Reginald. This is a court, not a drawing room." Verena rose slowly. "My lord," she said, her voice like silk drawn tight, "I would speak." The murmurs returned, startled and eager. Sir Reginald turned toward her in disbelief. "Verena, I will speak," she repeated, her chin lifting. The magistrate nodded once. She stepped forward. "I am the child's mother," she began, and Gabriel's breath caught. But then, after a pause that seemed to freeze time itself, she closed her eyes. "No," she whispered, "I am not." A collective inhale filled the room. "The child is not mine by birth," she said clearly, "but he is mine by heart, by promise, and by choice. He was born to my sister, Rowena Ainsley, deceased, under circumstances I will not detail here. I claimed him as my own to protect her name, our family, and this city from a scandal I feared would bring ruin." Her voice steadied. "I now realize that silence only serves those who prey upon it." Sir Reginald stood so abruptly, his chair scraped the floor. "That child is a bastard, born of shame and seduction. He has no place among the Ainsley lineage." Verena turned toward him, and though her face was pale, her eyes blazed with fire long held in check. "No, Reginald. What has no place among the Ainsley name is you." Gasps fluttered again. "I have evidence," Gabriel said, stepping forward. "May I present it?" The magistrate gestured for him to proceed. From the leather folder beneath his arm, Gabriel removed several items and placed them on the table. "First," he said, "the two halves of the ribbon. One was tied around the child's wrist when I found him. The other was recovered from Countess Ainsley's personal effects. They match precisely." He laid them side by side, torn silk, soft as breath, now reunited. "Second, a full medical report of the child's health, signed by myself and two midwives of good standing, confirming he was not abandoned due to illness or deformity, but left deliberately and with care." He set the document down, each page sealed and initialed. "Third, a signed statement from Mr. Edwin Standish, former solicitor to the Ainsley family, verifying that he did not write nor authorize the codicil added to the marriage settlement weeks after the Countess's ceremony." Gabriel paused, letting the words settle. "And lastly," he added, unfolding a final sheet, "an affidavit from Mr. Henry Leeds, scrivener of London, attesting that he was paid by Sir Reginald Carow to forge the amendment in question, under duress and promise of anonymity." A silence descended that no one dared disturb. The magistrate leaned forward slowly, reading the documents as his brow furrowed deeper and deeper. Sir Reginald's face had lost its color. His jaw worked silently, and a bead of sweat glistened at his temple. When the magistrate finally looked up, the room was silent as stone. "This case," he said, "has grown far beyond the scope of a custody petition." He tapped the affidavits. "I will require time to consider the full implications. For now, custody of the child will remain with Dr. Hartswell, pending further investigation. The court will reconvene in 1 fortnight." Sir Reginald opened his mouth to protest, but the magistrate raised a hand. and if further attempts are made to alter the record or intimidate witnesses, you may find yourself on the other side of this bench, Sir Reginald." With a nod, he struck the gavel once. The chamber erupted in murmurs, chairs scraping, shawls rustling, but Gabriel remained still. So did Verena. Only when the room had half emptied did she finally turn to him. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft. He looked at her, and for a moment the tension in his chest gave way to something warmer. "I told you I would protect him," he replied. "I did not say I would do it alone." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, fragile but unbreakable. At the far end of the hall, Sir Reginald's footsteps echoed as he left, his cane striking the floor with unnecessary force. His confidence had cracked, the first fissure in a facade built on threats and forged ink. And somewhere outside, beneath a gentler sky, the child slept, unaware that a battle had begun in his name, not with swords or soldiers, but with ribbon and resolve. The bells of Bath tolled 9 as the final lanterns were lit outside the assembly rooms, casting golden light upon the polished cobblestones, and the carriages lined up in careful procession. Within, the grand ballroom had been transformed into a cathedral of artifice and expectation. Silk draped the columns. A quartet played a delicate gavotte. Candles flickered in their sconces, their flames dancing against crystal chandeliers. Perfumed whispers hovered like mist. And at the center of it all stood Verena Ainsley, Countess of Ainsley, betrothed to Lord Julian Harbury. A union arranged with speed and calculation, like the signing of a treaty in wartime. She was adorned in a gown of ice-blue satin, the color chosen by Harbury himself to reflect what he called her regal stillness. The bodice shimmered with hand-sewn pearls, the sleeves edged in lace so fine it nearly vanished against her pale skin. But no jewels adorned her throat. No smile graced her lips. She moved among the guests like a statue brought to life, too perfect, too still, too cold. Her eyes met no one's for too long. Her hands remained gloved, unoffered. The murmur of admiration that followed her had no warmth. It was admiration born of distance and of discomfort. At the far end of the room, Sir Reginald Carow stood with arms folded, eyes tracking her like a falcon, watching its tethered prey. He had chosen every detail of the evening, the musicians, the wine, the guests. All of Bath's elite had been invited, from magistrates to titled widows, from colonels to aging heiresses. It was to be a celebration not of love, but of power, and Verena knew it. Lord Harbury approached her with a goblet of champagne, his smile fixed in place, his posture practiced. He leaned in. "You do look radiant," he murmured. "But I would be more assured if you pretended to enjoy yourself." She met his gaze with a softness that cut sharper than steel. "I do not pretend well, my lord." His expression stiffened. "Perhaps you'll learn, in time." Before she could reply, the footman at the door called out, loud and clear, "Dr. Gabriel Hartswell." A hush fell over the room. All heads turned, and there he stood, tall, solemn and uninvited. He wore a dark frock coat with brass buttons, boots polished, his hair carefully combed, though the wind had dared to disturb it. At his side walked a man unfamiliar to most, slight of build and nervous in posture. Mr. Henry Leeds, the London scrivener. Gabrielle's gaze swept across the room and stopped when it found her. For a single heartbeat, the distance between them vanished. The chandelier, the orchestra, the whispering crowd, none of it existed, only them. Then Verena turned, gracefully, toward the center of the ballroom and raised one hand. "I wish to speak." The murmurs grew louder. Sir Reginald stepped forward, fury rising in his throat. "Verena, I will be heard," she said, her voice cutting through the hall like a bell in winter. "This is, after all, my engagement ball, or so I was told." The musicians stopped. The clinking of glasses ceased. Only the fire crackled in its marble hearth. "I have been silent for too long," Verena said, stepping forward, her posture regal, her voice steady. "Out of duty, out of fear, but silence has become betrayal." Gabriel and the scrivener moved closer, but said nothing. They were not the speakers tonight. She looked around at the guests, each one draped in silk, velvet, powdered civility. Her hands trembled, but her gaze did not falter. The child rumored about this town, the child some call a scandal, an illegitimacy, a disgrace, is my nephew. He was born to my sister, Rowena Ainsley, who passed from this world with dignity and sorrow. I claimed her son to protect her name, and in doing so, I became the target of deceit. She paused. I will no longer be part of that deception. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Several matrons fanned themselves with more force than elegance. A colonel cleared his throat too loudly. Sir Reginald's face had turned to stone. Verena continued. I hereby withdraw from my engagement to Lord Harbury, whose political ambitions do not concern me. I will not marry for silence. I will not marry for appearances. I will not marry to bury a child beneath a title. Lord Harbury's face darkened. You dare humiliate me before all of them? I do not humiliate you, my lord, Verena replied. You did that yourself the moment you agreed to a bargain without honor. He stepped forward as if to seize her arm, but Gabriel moved between them with quiet, absolute resolve. She is not yours to touch, he said. Harbury looked as though he might strike him, but hesitated under the full weight of the crowd's gaze. Instead, he turned sharply and stormed from the ballroom, the doors slamming behind him like a final pronouncement. Sir Reginald's voice, low and seething, filled the vacuum he left behind. You've ruined everything. Verena turned to him. No, I've restored what you tried to destroy. The magistrate's seal was produced. The scrivener stepped forward, hands trembling, and handed the affidavit to a nearby steward, who read it aloud. The voice echoed, paid to falsify a codicil, under instruction of Sir Reginald Carow, willing to testify before the Crown. The truth was no longer rumor. It had taken form, ink and voice, oath and shame. Sir Reginald lunged, perhaps out of rage, perhaps out of desperation. But Gabriel was ready. He caught the older man's arm mid-swing. For a breath they stood locked, the fury of privilege meeting the calm of principle. Then 2 magistrate guards moved in, restrained Sir Reginald, and escorted him from the room. He did not go quietly. You'll regret this, Verena. You'll regret every breath you draw without my consent. She did not reply. The doors closed behind him. Silence returned, but it was different now. No longer the silence of oppression. It was the silence of respect. Verena turned back to the guests. I ask nothing of you, she said, only that you remember that love, in all its forms, is never a crime. Then she descended the steps, head high, her gaze finding Gabriel's once more. He extended his hand. She took it. And though no music played and no one bowed, the moment felt more royal than any ball ever held within those walls. They left together without shame. Outside, the night had shifted. Rain fell lightly, not as a storm, but as a benediction. Behind them, the assembly rooms remained lit, but the truth had already stepped beyond its walls, carried not in scandal, but in resolve. And from a high window in Gay Street, a baby stirred in his sleep, as if sensing that his name had finally been spoken aloud, not with fear, but with love. The great storm had passed, though the winds it stirred would linger long in the corners of Bath's drawing rooms and whispered conversations. And yet, for Verena Ainsley, what remained was not ruin, but space, blessed, quiet space. On the eastern edge of the city, nestled between sloping fields and a thin copse of ash trees, stood Thornley Cottage, a modest estate once belonging to a widowed aunt on her mother's side. It was no grand manor. The walls were pale stone, the windows narrow but welcoming. Vines clung to the shutters as if trying to remember summer, and a small greenhouse, long abandoned, leaned against the southern wall like a forgotten dream. It was hers now, not through inheritance nor favor, but by her own hand. She had sold the last of her mother's jewels, the brooch worn only once, and used the money to purchase peace. A home with no portraits watching her, no servants paid to report her moods, no polished floors echoing with unsaid accusations. Nicholas slept each night in a cradle by the hearth, the same cradle where Rowena once placed him, his little fists raised in sleep as if warding off dreams too large for his tiny form. Verena would sit near the fire, sewing by lamplight, listening to the rhythms of his breathing. There were nights she did not light any candles at all, just held him against her chest and let the silence speak. She no longer asked the world to forgive her. She asked only that it let her begin again. Meanwhile, on Gay Street, Gabriel's practice shifted, though he neither mourned nor celebrated it. A few titled families withdrew their patronage, citing ambiguous, reputational concerns. The Lady Everbrook, in particular, sent a polite note suggesting he had grown too emotional in his judgments, followed by the quiet defection of her entire household. But others came. Widows with stiff joints, governesses with raw lungs, children from the outer lanes with fevered brows. They came without lace gloves or calling cards, but with honesty and need. Gabriel, always a man of science, had once believed that reputation was armor. Now he understood it was often a cage, and so he shed it, not in defiance, but in choice. He no longer sought the approval of those who dined on silks and secrets. He sought truth. He sought rest. He sought her. On the third Tuesday of March, the sun returned, if only briefly. It filtered through the clouds in long golden threads and warmed the windows of Thornley Cottage just enough to stir the scent of lavender from the garden beds. Eleanora Pike had arrived early, bringing bread still warm and a knitted shawl far too thick for the season. She bustled in with her usual air of gentle command, inspecting Nicholas with a nurse's scrutiny before placing him in Gabriel's waiting arms. "Careful with his neck," she murmured. "And mind the back of his head, he's growing faster than a weed." Gabriel chuckled as the baby wriggled in his arms, letting out a small, triumphant gurgle. Then, a sound. Soft, surprised, delighted, a laugh. The first. It escaped Nicholas like music, sudden and clear, as his little hand grabbed hold of Gabriel's cravat and tugged. Gabriel froze, eyes wide, then broke into a smile that seemed to lift the weight of every courtroom, every night watch, every unspoken fear he had carried since that morning on the bridge. Eleanora gasped, a hand to her chest. "Oh, my stars! He's laughing." From the next room, the sound reached Verena. She had been folding linens, but the motion ceased the moment she heard it. It was not just laughter, it was life. And she, who had held him first, sung to him in a voice no one else had heard, stood still as tears slipped down her cheeks, quiet and unbidden. She pressed a hand to her mouth. It wasn't sorrow, it was grace. Days passed gently. The fields surrounding Thornley turned green with spring's return, dotted with primroses and bluebells, and the sky took on a softness that felt almost merciful. Verena and Gabriel began to walk each afternoon, never far, never fast. Just far enough to leave the house behind, to hear the rustle of grass beneath their feet and the distant call of birds above. They walked along the hedgerows, beside the dry stone walls, beneath clouds shaped like letters unsent. They spoke little at first, but as days passed, the quiet gave way to memories. Verena spoke of Rowena, not just her death, but her laugh, her stubbornness, her fierce devotion. "She was always braver than I was," Verena said one afternoon, standing beside a wild hawthorn tree. "I played by the rules. She set them on fire." Gabriel smiled, hands in his coat pockets. "Then Nicholas will have both your blood in him, justice and fire." She glanced at him, eyes narrowed in the light. "And what will he learn from you?" He paused, then answered quietly, "That sometimes saving a life is not just about stopping death. Sometimes it's about defending a future." They stood in silence, the wind moving gently through the grass around them. She turned away, but not before he saw the shadow flicker across her face. That evening, as the sky turned from peach to indigo, Verena made a decision. The following morning, she dressed in quiet, determined movements. a black bonnet, a deep grey cloak, gloves lined with silk. Gabriel met her at the gate without question. He knew. The carriage ride was silent. They passed the abbey, the baths, the market square, each place heavy with memory, but she did not falter. They continued uphill to the cemetery at St. Thomas of the Vale, where stone angels leaned over names softened by moss and time. Rowena's grave was near the eastern wall, beneath a beech tree that had not yet bloomed. The marker was simple. Rowena Ainsley, beloved daughter, taken too soon. Verena stood before it, motionless. Gabriel remained a few steps behind, his presence a quiet shield. "I haven't been here since the burial," she said, her voice barely audible. I couldn't bear the lies carved into the marble." Gabriel did not speak. She knelt, pulling a small satchel from her cloak. Inside, a bundle, a ribbon, a note, a lock of hair, and a name. "Nicholas," she whispered. "He knows you, Rowena. He knows your lullaby. He has your temper and your laugh." She placed the bundle at the base of the stone. "I told the world he was mine. I bore the shame so you wouldn't have to, but I never stopped knowing he was yours." Her hand trembled as she touched the earth. "I kept your secret because I loved you. I break it now, because I still do." Behind her, Gabriel felt something inside him shift. Not pity, not admiration, something deeper, a knowing. She rose slowly, her face pale but composed. As she turned toward him, their eyes met. There was no need for words. She had come to bury silence, and in doing so, she had made space for truth. Together, they walked back through the cemetery path, not as physician and patient, not as savior and fallen, but as two souls carrying the weight of love, not chosen, but inherited. The wind rustled the branches above them, and in the distance Bath stirred, unaware that something had quietly, irrevocably changed. Because now there was no longer shame in the name, only memory, and a child who laughed. The countryside chapel stood quietly beneath a sky laced with pale clouds, its stone walls softened by moss and age. Nestled between rolling green hills and a gentle stream that caught the light like glass, the chapel had long been forgotten by Bath society, used now only for small harvest blessings and distant burials. But on this morning it held something rare, something holy, not because of grandeur, but because of truth. A fire had been lit in the old hearth. Wildflowers had been gathered by hand, none purchased, none arranged by servants, and tied into modest bundles placed along the pews. The wooden altar, worn with time and reverence, had been draped with linen stitched by Eleanora Pike herself. A baptismal font, chipped at one edge, glistened with clean spring water drawn before sunrise. It was the christening of a child once left on a bridge, and no one present spoke of shame. They came in ones and twos, walking along the narrow path leading from the meadow. Old Mrs. Honeywick, who had once crossed the street to avoid Verena, now held a small knitted cap in her trembling hands. The miller's wife brought sweet bread wrapped in a blue cloth. A shy boy, no older than 10, held a carved wooden lamb tucked beneath his arm and stared at the baby with wide-eyed awe. Gabriel stood near the altar, cradling Nicholas against his chest. The child wore a christening gown that had belonged to Rowena, simple muslin trimmed in faded lace, recently mended by Verena's careful needle. His cheeks were rosy, his eyes alert, as if sensing that this moment mattered. Verena entered last. She wore a pale ivory day dress with a high collar and fitted sleeves, cinched with a narrow blue ribbon that echoed the one she had once torn in grief. Her hair was drawn back in a soft twist, with only a pearl pin holding it in place. There were no jewels, no titles, only the quiet weight of decision worn with grace. She took her place beside Gabriel without a word. Reverend Thomas Brackley stood at the head of the small congregation, the Book of Common Prayer held in hand, steadied not by ease, but by conviction. His bishop had advised against his presence. The ecclesiastical board had warned him, but he had replied that no higher authority could oppose love made visible. He cleared his throat and began. In the sight of God and before these witnesses, we come together to give this child a name and bless the beginning of a life we have already come to cherish." His voice was firm, but Verena could hear the tremor beneath it. Gabriel stepped forward first, carrying Nicholas to the font. The baby kicked once, then settled. Verena approached beside him, her gloved hand lightly brushing his forearm. Reverend Brackley asked, "Who brings this child to be named?" Verena raised her chin. "I do. And what name shall he bear?" She inhaled slowly. Her eyes did not search the room, nor Gabriel's face. They were fixed on the child. "Nicholas Gabriel Ainsley," she said clearly, "for his mother, who loved him, and for the man who saved him." There was a hush, thick with meaning. Gabriel bowed his head. Eleonora, standing at the back with a handkerchief clutched in her fist, let out a quiet sob. Reverend Brackley smiled faintly, then leaned forward and touched the water to Nicholas's forehead. "I baptize you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost." The child did not cry. He blinked, solemn and curious, as if receiving the name with understanding. After the final prayer, the small crowd began to disperse slowly, exchanging glances that had nothing of gossip in them. There was warmth now, tentative, hard-won, but real. Eleonora knelt beside Nicholas's cradle, her tears falling softly as she pressed her hand to his little foot through the muslin. "You'll never be alone again," she whispered. "Not ever." Outside the chapel, the spring wind stirred through the grass. Gabriel and Verena walked down the path together, leaving the voices behind, the sun brushing their shoulders as they reached the lime tree by the stream. The branches swayed above them, casting dappled shadows across the ground. Gabriel paused there, setting down the wicker basket that held the child's shawl and bonnet. Verena turned toward him. He did not touch her. He simply looked into her eyes, into her silence, into the places that had once known only survival. "I would stay," he said quietly, "even if you never chose me." Her breath caught. "But if you did," he continued, "I would never leave again." She said nothing for a long moment. The stream murmured nearby. A bee drifted past. In the chapel behind them, the door creaked as it swung closed. Then she nodded, not out of obligation, not out of fear, but because she had searched herself and found the answer waiting. "Yes," she said, with a soft conviction that left no room for doubt. "Yes." He took her hand, not to claim it, only to hold it. Their fingers laced as if they had always belonged. Gabriel did not kiss her. He did not step closer. They stood still beneath the lime tree, their hands joined, hearts steady, breaths shared. Above them, the clouds parted, and the sun fell across Verena's face like a benediction. Nicholas stirred in the basket, his tiny fingers curling into a fist. And Bath, for all its pride and polish, was far away. Here, by a stream, beneath a tree, in the company of no one but truth, a family had been named, and love had been chosen freely. The wind that once howled through winter mist now danced softly over the hills, fragrant with wild thyme and lavender. Summer had arrived in Bath, not with the sudden flourish of a parade, but in the quiet confidence of long days and golden skies. Along the winding road that led out of the town and into the countryside, a family walked slowly, without haste, without fear. Verena's hand was clasped within Gabriel's, their fingers gently interlaced. She wore a soft blue day dress, the fabric whispering with each step, its shade as pale as the morning sky over Thornley Cottage. Her pearl pin, once stored away and forgotten in a jewelry box she had not dared open for months, now held her hair in a loose twist. She had chosen it herself, not to please society, nor to fulfill an image, but because it was hers, and she had finally reclaimed what that meant. On Gabriel's chest, nestled in a cotton sling, Nicholas blinked at the changing light. His tiny hands gripped the edge of the cloth, his wide eyes absorbing the movement of trees, clouds, and the shifting expressions on the faces of his parents. For he was theirs now, unquestioned, unchallenged, and unconditionally loved. The stone bridge loomed just ahead. Once it had been the site of unbearable silence, of a decision born of desperation, of a lullaby carried away on cold air. But now, in the amber light of late afternoon, it no longer stood as a place of loss. It had become a passage between past and future, between what was sacrificed and what was salvaged. Verena paused at its edge. Her breath caught, not in sorrow, but in reverence. "I never thought I would return here," she murmured. Gabriel looked at her, his gaze steady. "You never left him behind." She turned toward him then, her eyes warm with something beyond words. "But I almost left myself." "Then it's time to cross together," he said, tightening his grip on her hand. They stepped onto the bridge. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long golden shafts across the stone path beneath their feet. The water below shimmered like burnished glass, gentle ripples catching the light as if nature itself had bent toward celebration. Swallows dipped and turned in the air, their wings flashing against a sky painted in hues of rose and coral. Verena paused halfway across. She looked down at the water and then ahead, where the other side of the bridge awaited. Then she looked at Gabriel. He reached into his coat pocket. From it he withdrew a small gold band. It gleamed not with wealth or extravagance, but with the quiet beauty of something chosen with care. There were no diamonds, no elaborate engraving, only simplicity, purity. She said nothing. Her breath trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of what this moment meant. Gabriel took her hand gently and lifted it. "I have nothing more to offer than this," he said. "No title, no grand estate. Only the truth of my heart and the promise that I will never ask you to be anyone other than who you are." Tears gathered at the corners of her eyes, but she smiled. "And that," she whispered, "is everything." He slid the band onto her finger. As the ring settled into place, Nicholas let out a small, delighted clap from the sling. His laughter echoed faintly through the warm air, and Verena laughed softly with him, tears falling now, not of sorrow, but of joy so deep it startled her. From a distance, just beyond the hedgerows and between the trees, a handful of townspeople watched. They had not come to intrude or gawk. There was no carriages, no fanfare, only quiet presence. The baker, with flour on her apron, the bookseller's wife, the boy who had carved the wooden lamb, and Eleonora standing at the edge of the hill with a handkerchief pressed delicately to her lips, her smile trembling but full. They did not cheer, they did not call out, they simply watched, no longer judging, but witnessing. And Verena, once whispered about, once pitied, once scorned, held her head high. She was no longer the girl who had trembled behind lace gloves. She was a woman who had crossed grief, fire, and shame, and arrived at herself. They continued walking, the three of them, across the bridge and into the deepening light. Each step carried memory, but none of it held them back. Gabriel's arm brushed hers. Nicholas's soft babble filled the quiet between them. Verena closed her eyes for a moment and simply breathed. There was no carriage waiting on the other side. There was no feast, no herald, only a path, winding and unknown, and love. Not the love of novels written by distant hands, nor the kind sold in grand ballrooms and pressed into folded letters. This love was quieter, truer. It lived in the way Gabriel reached to steady her, even when she didn't stumble, in the way Nicholas nestled against her heartbeat, in the way she had learned to trust again. The sun dipped lower. Shadows lengthened. The wind carried the scent of summer grass and distant honeysuckle. They walked forward, one step, then another. Not away from pain, but through it. Not toward perfection, but toward peace. And though no one spoke it aloud, they all knew it. The bridge between love and courage had been crossed, and this time, no one would be left behind. The orchard behind Thornley Cottage bloomed early that year. It was mid-April, and the apple trees unfurled their petals like tiny stars against the blue sky, casting a snow of pink and white over the path where Verena walked with slow steps, and a full heart. She carried a basket in one arm, her skirts brushing the grass, and her other hand held the smallest fingers in the world, belonging to 4-year-old Eliza, whose dark curls were pinned with a crooked bow and whose eyes carried the stubborn mischief of her father. From the garden beyond, the sound of laughter echoed, a boy's voice, clear and proud. "Don't let her win, Papa. She cheats." "That's called strategy, Nicholas," came Gabriel's teasing reply, "and your sister is very good at it." Eliza giggled and pulled Verena toward the others. "Come see." Verena smiled, her cheeks flushed with spring sunlight. Her steps were slower now. Age had not touched her, but peace had, and it lived in the soft lines at the corners of her mouth and the stillness in her gaze. She was no longer the girl who had once stood alone at the edge of the stone bridge. She had become something rarer, a woman who had rebuilt her life, not with grand declarations, but with daily truth. Gabriel knelt by the flower bed, sleeves rolled to his elbows, his hands streaked with dirt. Beside him, now 12, stood Nicholas, taller than most boys his age, with a quiet thoughtfulness that had never left him. His eyes, Rowena's eyes, searched the garden with focus as he held out a watering can for his sister. "She's overfeeding the roses again," he told his mother with the authority of an older brother. "She calls it love," Verena replied with a wink, kneeling to kiss Eliza's cheek. Gabriel stood and crossed to her, wiping his hands on his apron. He pressed a kiss to her temple and wrapped an arm around her waist with a familiarity that still made her breath catch. Not from surprise anymore, but from the enduring wonder of it. They had married without fuss. No lace-draped ceremonies or grand invitations, only a quiet service in the same countryside chapel where Nicholas had been named. Eleonora had cried through the entire thing. Now, 8 years later, Eleonora still lived with them, though she spent more time in the sewing room than in the kitchen. She had become Bath's most sought-after dressmaker, not because she chased fashion, but because she knew how to dress women who had learned to carry their own weight. She had never remarried, but sometimes Verena saw her walking by the stream with Reverend Brackley, their steps unhurried, their conversation private. He had remained at his post, weathering pressure from the bishopric with a stern dignity that reminded everyone why faith, when married to conscience, became something unshakable. As for Sir Reginald, his name had all but vanished. After his arrest, he had been quietly disinherited by distant relatives, eager to protect their own fortunes. No trial had followed, only exile. Rumor placed him in Vienna, disgraced, forgotten. Verena never spoke of him. Gabriel never asked. The past, they agreed, had already taken too much, but the present bloomed like the orchard. Nicholas had begun attending lectures in Bath once a week, invited by a retired solicitor who had once judged him silently, but now called him a fine mind. Eliza had recently decided she would become either a physician or a pirate, depending on the week. Gabriel had expanded his practice, accepting apprentices and offering care to those who couldn't pay. And Verena, Countess no more, had published a book under the name V.A. Thornley, a collection of essays and stories about women who had stood in silence too long. It had reached London and stayed there. On the evening of the orchard's fullest bloom, they gathered beneath the old lime tree by the stream. A table had been set with simple plates, fresh bread and cheese, wine for the grown-ups, apple cordial for the children. Verena watched the sunlight melt into gold, painting her family in warmth. Gabriel reached across the table, touching her hand. "I never thought the world could be kind," she whispered. He smiled. "It isn't, not always, but we are, and that makes it enough." Later, when the stars pricked the indigo sky and Nicholas had carried a sleepy Eliza back inside, Verena remained outside, wrapped in her shawl, standing where she could just glimpse the ridge beyond which the stone bridge stood. She no longer feared it, she no longer mourned it. It had given her everything, her son, her courage, her name. She touched the simple gold band on her finger. Then, from inside the cottage, came Gabriel's voice. "Come to bed, love." And she turned, toward the voice, toward the light, toward the life that had once seemed impossible. Because in the end, love had not been a miracle. It had been a choice, made again, and again, and again. In a world where reputation often outweighs truth, and appearances hold more power than compassion, Verina's journey reminds us that love is not born from perfection, but from courage. Courage to tell the truth. Courage to raise a child born of scandal. Courage to rebuild a life with dignity even after the fire. Her story teaches us that healing doesn't arrive all at once. It unfolds slowly, through small choices, quiet loyalty, and the people who stay when others walk away. It tells us that sometimes the bridge we fear the most becomes the path to our greatest joy. If you felt moved by this story, if you stayed until the final word, we invite you to write the word courage in the comments below. That way, we'll know who walked every step of this journey with us, and it helps others find this story too. We would love to hear from you. What part of Verina's story touched your heart the most? Did you see yourself in her strength, in Gabriel's patience, in Eleonora's quiet resilience? If you'd like to help us continue creating more heartfelt period dramas like this one, you can support our storytelling team with a super thanks. Any amount, big or small, truly makes a difference. And if that's not possible right now, just sharing this video with a friend or loved one is another beautiful way to help this story reach more hearts. Thank you for watching, for feeling, and for believing in the power of love, truth, and redemption. Don't forget to check the cards. We've selected other historical romances you might fall in love with next. Until our next story, stay brave, stay kind, stay true,